I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Diego Báez here 5 years later on Concavity Show.
Oh.
Hey, welcome back, Diego Báez. Yeah, it has been 5 years. So longtime listeners of the show might remember that we had you on in 2018 in April for episode 37 when you were on with Andrea Lawrencelle Sheridan. We were talking about David Foster Wallace society stuff and diversity at the time. And now almost, over 5 years ago, here we are. And life has changed a little bit for some of us.
Yeah,
Big developments in
bit.
that time. Pandemics and new children and all that kind of stuff. Welcome back, man. It's great to see you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
And this time we're here to talk about your book and not David Foster Wallace. For the record, I have zero questions for you about
Wallace. I have one. I made
Wallace
one connection.
and the society
cool.
in the
in your
journal.
book.
Okay. I do have to put in a plug that we just published issue 4 of our journal, which was delayed for like 2.5 years due to the pandemic. So it still feels like, you know how corporations are like returning to the office, like it's taken all this like years of negotiation to be like, okay, finally, are we getting back to not normal, but the new normal? But it's like we're coming back out of that, publishing journals. We've got Diego back on the show. It feels like maybe it's taken us 5 years to ramp up to this. So
nature's
welcome back,
healing.
Nature's so for people who were not around, we've built our audience a little bit since then. I'm going to give your basically bio from the book, which we're going to ask you to pronounce here because we would probably not pronounce it in Guarani. I assume it's a Guarani word. Can you
for
pronounce
sure?
it
Yeah.
for
So
us?
the title of the book is Yaguareté White, which comes from the Guarani and means, essentially white jaguar. But part of my intention in kind of making it difficult to read, hopefully reflects some of the themes of the book in terms of just difficulty and confusion and sort of something of a sense of bewilderment. So even to begin with a title that's kind of like, I like how it looks, but I realized very quickly, like, this is hard to pronounce. Like, I don't know if anyone's going to be able to read the title, but there it is, Yaguareté White.
Yeah, there's a lot of like linguistic whiplash in this book, like a lot of English and Spanish and all three.
And we'll get into that, but the book is coming out. It's officially published in February. We're recording this middle of December, so by the time people hear it, they can pre-order the book from it's University of Arizona Press. It's forthcoming, and again, for people who don't know you or only familiar with you through your involvement in the Wallace Society, I'm going to read your bio from the book, which says Diego Báez is a writer, educator, and abolitionist. I want to ask you about that.
Yeah, me too.
He is the recipient of fellowships from Canto Mundo, the Surge Institute, the Poetry Foundation's incubator for community engaged poets. He has reviewed books for Booklist, Harriet Books, Boston Globe. Other writing has appeared or is forthcoming in Freeman's. I really like Freeman's. The Georgia Review and Latino Poetry, a new anthology. Live in Chicago, teach at City College. And you used to be, I don't know if you still are, on the board of the National Book Critics Circle.
I was. I cycled off earlier this year. So 22 was my last year, and I hope to rejoin at some point in the future. But man, it is a commitment, and I wasn't able. I needed to step away for a little while.
You weren't prepared for that, and they had some issues when you were there.
That's why I came on, actually. I mean, I don't know how much we don't want to get into it, but I was very fortunate to kind of step in at a time of transition, and then I really enjoyed it, made a lot of great people, but then, it really demands more than I was able to give it at the time. So,
gotcha. Abolitionist. You want to tell us what you're advocating for the abolition?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a lot of things. I was surprised. This was the first question I got when I did a reading at Wilbur Wright College, which is one of the other city colleges here in Chicago. And right off the bat, that's what one of the students asked. It was like, abolitionists, what do you mean by that? And I was glad for that because nobody had brought it up before. I don't have a chance to have that many conversations about it, so I was really grateful for that. It also gave me practice because I hope to be able to talk about it more. I mean, I guess the short of it is, I fundamentally believe that institutions like the police and prisons don't make society better. That in fact they just exacerbate relations, capitalist relations as the status quo, and in fact hurt more people than they help.
Yeah.
I mean, you can expand out from that and say that like even ways of thinking and ways of behaving in the world and interacting with other people too can. It doesn't have to be. It's not just the existence of police and prisons. It's how we police our own thoughts and our own actions, etc. And we can get more narrow than that too, because I'm an optimist. I do believe that a society can function without those institutions. I also believe that like individuals who are either officers themselves or working in the prisons can also be rehabilitated. Like I don't think that they are all bad people. I don't think that that's true. Um, so I have to be an optimist, but I'm also a realist. Like I know this is going to happen overnight, and in fact,
Yeah.
if it were to happen overnight, it'd cause way more problems than it solves. Um, the reason that I put it in my bio is because I'm not on the forefront of this thinking. There are a lot of, especially Black women, who are doing great thinking, like Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba and others, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who are way smarter than me and just have the experiences to speak in a way that is I find very convincing. So I feel like there are other ways that I can try to like put forward this agenda. And one way is just to throw it in my bio and hope that people ask about it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little risky because like I say, there are people who are really putting their lives where their mouths are, and I'm trying to do that. But this just seems like a first step, to just even start a conversation with folks who might be like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, what do you mean by that? Like that sounds kind of intense. Like what is that all about? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's a big topic of conversation, obviously, since George Floyd, and I was involved in some community activism here in Austin and in Texas, where there was sort of backlash and then backlash to the
Mhm.
backlash, and the police were very antagonistic in our city about defunding the police and abolish the
Mm-hmm.
police, and they basically put out a misinformation campaign saying that Austin had defunded the police. And in fact, they had increased police
Mm-hmm.
funding, but they had actually stopped responding to
Mm.
certain calls. And so it was almost like if you did abolish the police, I don't know that you would notice because they didn't respond to anything, anyways. Like there's tons and tons of stories, even now, of people who call the police for robbery, theft, burglary, and they just don't. They just say, "What do you want us to
Mhm.
do?" You
Mhm.
know, we're not going to file a report. We're not coming out there, or they're not going to pick up, or they say, okay, we'll send someone out, and they never do. And that sort of, I don't know, antagonism at the community level, where it's us against them. That feels very not conducive to community.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
anyway, that's really
Yeah.
interesting. I would love to just make a whole show about that, but I want to talk about your poems. So I think this is the first real true book of poetry
I
we've
was
done on
gonna
the
say
show.
that
Correct me if
too.
I'm
That
wrong,
struck
Dave.
me as I was thinking about this. We've never had, a book of poetry as the core piece that we were looking at. So this
I
is a
feel very honored. I'm not kidding.
cool move for us.
well, we are really excited about it because Dave and I were kind of chatting a little bit today behind the scenes and saying, for me this is a different type of poetry, and that you really do play with
Mm-hmm.
form a lot, and there's some stuff that's maybe even like prose
Mhm.
poetry in here or found poems. Do you
Postcards,
want to
yeah.
talk about yeah, like your background as a
Mhm.
poet? Like, I mean, I knew you as like a critic before I knew you as a poet. So like, I wouldn't say it was a surprise to me that you're publishing a book of poetry, but like, it sounds like you've been always writing poetry. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Oh yeah, for a very long time. The earliest drafts of some of these poems I found in my email back in from like 2007, 2008.
Oh wow, okay.
Not most of them,
So
but a couple of them. Like one poem, "The Skin." I drafted an earlier version via email before I was even in grad school. That was that long ago, and it has made it into the book. But when I realized that, I was like, okay, these poems need to be in the world. I need to move on. I need to be done with these.
Not just living in your Gmail drive or something.
Exactly. Yeah, my Google
Yeah,
Docs for
in your cloud.
perpetuity.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah. So I've been at work on writing poems for, I guess, well, how long has that been? 13, 14, 15 years. Like, seriously, I think. And then putting them into the container of the book didn't really happen until more recently. And in about 2017, I felt like I had a book together. I had enough poems to like comprise a book. And I started asking some folks to look at it, some mentors and friends and other folks, and quickly learned that like there's a lot I could do differently. And so then fast forward, 4 or 5 years, and it finally gets into basically the shape that it's in now, minus the title. So the title and the title poem, and then a couple of poems came later, but the title and the title poem changed pretty recently. I mean, it feels both recent and kind of a long time ago, because it was in 20, I want to say 2021. I had a dear friend, Rosebud Benoni. She's a great poet. Give me some edits and look at it. And the title at the time was called Valleys Full of Jaguars, and it was meant to be ironic because there aren't. I've never seen a jaguar in Paraguay. I've never encountered one. I don't think they're that not
Common.
popular is not the right word, but there's not that many of them. And Rosebud was like, "There's no jaguars in your book. You need to change the title." I was like, "Okay, fair. Irony's not landing there. Fine." And so I kind of thought about it. What am I trying to do? I'm trying to explore both ends of this identity, which is my dad is from Paraguay, and so there's that, and then my mom's white from Pennsylvania, and then there's that. And I thought, why don't I throw these terms together? Because so many of the poems are about like language, and like you said earlier, Dave, linguistic whiplash, which I like. I wrote that down.
Cool.
I wanted to kind of combine them together.
Yeah.
And then I wrote the title poem in more or less one sitting, because it just felt like the right way to frame what then became the rest of the book. And so it's been a journey. I'm very happy. It's also weird. I mean, Matt, I know you published. Well, I know we're not doing video, but I know you published your book recently, and it's weird, right? To like finish a thing, and then you're done with it. Nobody else has read it yet,
Right.
and you're just kind of like, will anybody read it? Is it going to be a thing? And so I feel very grateful to like talk with you guys about this, and just kind of twiddling my thumbs until February, when hopefully more people will read it.
Totally. Yeah. Well, we're very
Yeah,
feel
I mean,
very privileged and honored that you sent this to us early, that we got a sneak glimpse of it, and we got to experience this before like most people in the world. It feels like
Early adopters.
very wonderful. Early adopters, yeah. So thank you for sending it our way. It's a delight.
and that was a pretty good summary you were giving there of, your mom and your dad, and your identity is, that's probably the main subject of the
Totally.
book, if
Yeah.
not one of the main subjects of the book. And I mean, Paraguay obviously plays a big part in your identity and in, the language. I didn't know much about, honestly, didn't know anything about Guarani, as you say it,
Yeah.
until reading this, and went to look up some YouTube videos to hear people speak it, because reading it is uh, impossible if you don't know how it's pronounced. I mean, in your head, you're just making it up. So phonetically, I think it's a really interesting choice for some of these poems. Do you want to talk about like that decision, or did you grow up hearing your dad say a lot of these words, and it was sort of baked into your
Childhood.
childhood?
Yeah, I mean both. I mean, like you described it actually quite accurately, because it's kind of both. Where I did grow up, I have two really core memories of my dad speaking Guarani. The first is on the phone, and this was before cell phones were super popular, and they certainly weren't in Paraguay. But he would have his calling card, so he'd punch in his like 27 numbers to call the like, I don't know what's the equivalent now. It's like a phone booth like station that they have in downtown Villarrica, where my dad's family's from. And so he'd call whoever on the other end and just have to shout into the handset rather, because the connection was so bad and it would drop all the time. But that's a core memory growing up. It was my dad shouting in the background in Guarani. And like you say, if you listen to it, if anyone wants to go onto YouTube and listen to it, it's an incredibly interesting language. Like, it's very nasally. It's got a lot of like short sounds, and like I don't speak a whole lot of it myself. I'm trying to learn a little bit more, so I can, like, there are a couple vocab words that I'll work with my my daughter on, like puh is foot and kambu is milk, and I don't know, there's some others, but
You got to do the
Yeah, the
Waterman,
Yeah,
E.
it's like ugh, or like
Ew.
sort of, yeah.
And that's water.
but it's
Just
spelled
Y, just the
Y.
It's
letter
It's
just
just
Y,
like
Y.
right?
Y,
Like and
but
in
it's like
Spanish, yeah.
ugh.
It's a
Yes,
great
yeah.
section
It's
on that.
very hard to conceive of that. But and it's not like cognates with Spanish, I should say. Like this is an indigenous language, right?
And it's
And
it was not sanctified, that's not the right word. It was adopted. I mean, it was adopted by the state, of Paraguay as one of the two national languages. So it is taught in the schools.
Hmm. Cool.
I mean, my dad grew up in the country, like a village outside a town, and so they speak it more in the rural areas, anyways, and they kind of mix it with Spanish into Jopara, which is like Spanglish sort of, but with Guarani.
Hmm.
And so now, though, even my cousins, my primates who grow up in the city, they learn it in school, and it's interesting. Again, it's so interesting because I grew up with it as a part of me. It's in the household. I can't really speak it, and then when we go down there, we don't really observe, or it was hard for me as a kid or as a young person to observe the different dynamics where they don't speak Guarani so much in the cities because city life requires a different kind of vocabulary than country life, right?
Hmm.
And also,
Interesting.
though, if you're like hanging out with some friends or family members and you're making jokes and teasing each other, Guarani really lends itself to that. But if you're trying to talk about like your bank account or your resume or whatever, it doesn't. It's not quite
Anything
the right
related to
language for it, right?
capitalism sounds like
Yeah, yeah. And
interesting
so
that.
well,
and so the way I've tried to work it into the book is sometimes popping in vocabulary words that felt right, and other times trying to be, I guess, honest or authentic about the fact that I don't actually speak this language fluently,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
weird. It's a weird territory to navigate, I think, as a poet.
Yeah. And the whole kind of theme of this book is like your experience trying to navigate nationalities, languages, borders, being American, having heritage from Paraguay. Like that is the fabric of this book, and you're working through negotiating that, and then with your parents, with yourself, and also with your daughter, with the next generation of how does all this familial generational heritage and lineage and nationality all intermingle and work together, and it makes for a really rich and sort of fascinating book of poetry that's all thematically linked from start to finish. And it's interesting that like there's a note at the back that a bunch of these poems were published in other places earlier, right? And now they are a collection, but there's such a great cohesion to it, even though they've come from such a long period of time, like you said. And I think probably the period of time did a lot of justice to this work because it gave you the time to write about different experiences from different sort of geological time periods in your life, being a child, being an adult, being a father, um, thinking back on your childhood as an adult man with your own child now. Like that lends itself to a lot of different ways of thinking about your own childhood, I think. Um, so all that stuff weaves throughout this book of poetry, and it makes for just a really rich, wonderful reading experience.
I
Thank you
appreciate
for
you
it.
saying that, and that whole dimension of my
Mhm.
own experience of fatherhood didn't exist 4.5 years ago.
Exactly right, and it enriches the book so wonderfully. You know, it'd be a different, it'd feel
Well,
like a
that's
different
right.
book in some ways without it. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
you're absolutely right about that. Like I had a bunch of poems before, and then
Hmm.
opening this totally different door. Um, in a sense, I don't think I coined this phrase, but I've been thinking about the bi-directionality of inheritance, where obviously we
Mm.
take things from our parents and we give things to our children, but we also take things from our children. And in a sense, like this book doesn't exist without my kid being born because it just
Hmm.
changed my relationship to, like you said, my own memories and experiences as a kid, but also like
Yeah,
now what am I trying to pass on
yeah,
linguistically and culturally and familially,
yeah.
etc.
Hmm.
well, you mentioned the first poem, which does basically say there are no jaguars in your, my father's village in Paraguay, and one of the explanations I was reading for why Guarani survived as an official language was that the Spanish didn't really care about Paraguay, and they didn't send over very many like colonists. They didn't put as many people there, so most of it was single men who were marrying Guarani women, and they had children who were bilingual, just exactly like what you're describing. And so you have these bilingual kids, And they didn't send over a lot of Spanish women, so they've just got these Spanish men who are really intermarrying with the indigenous people, and that's how the sort of language survived. Probably was that mothers and their children were passing this down from generation to generation, whereas other countries in Mexico where the Spanish were really sort of terrorizing and bringing over tons and tons of ships. There's no ports in Paraguay, right? Like, it's a landlocked country. It's harder to get to. Not a lot of natural resources there. So I wanted to ask you about that opening poem a bit. Could you speak a bit about that process? You've kind of mentioned, was it one of the later ones that you
Yeah.
wrote here?
Yeah, definitely. And so the notion of like there's no jaguars here and I don't know how to pronounce this word, and um my friend Jeff Martin, who's also a writer, who's also Canadian, he um gave me a term that was really clarifying, and I didn't know it before I had put the book together, but it's helped me really think about what I was actually trying to do, or what I ended up doing, I guess. He mentioned the apophatic tradition in religious practices, which is like defining a thing by what it is not. And I mean, I think I didn't I wasn't familiar with it beforehand, but it means like, not being able to, the ineffable name of God. You can't describe a thing that is beyond our comprehension, so you can only say what it's not. And I found it really enlightening for how I've been talking about, at least in that first poem, how I've been talking about, you know, who the speaker is and what his relationship to the country is, or countries, and even just and the languages, of course, as well, because it's trying to be as authentic as possible, in the sense that this is it's a foreign language, I guess, in another country, but it also feels like something that belongs to the speaker, belongs to me, in a way that it sort of becomes tricky walking the line between appreciating the culture and appropriating the culture. And I spent like a while getting kind of in my head about that, about like what's the right tone to strike with regard to these topics. Is it too ironic and disingenuous? Am I being too authentic and sentimental, or is it trying to kind of do both and navigate that a little bit? um Hope, yeah, I don't know, I guess we'll see how it lands. But
Well, in some of the other parts of the book are, set in Illinois,
Yeah.
which I'm assuming that's where
Normal.
you grew up, in
Bloomington.
Normal,
that's right.
Illinois, Bloomington Normal, and that's where we
Yeah.
met you, was in Bloomington Normal. So that was an easy commute for you to get to the David Foster Wallace
Yeah.
conference.
I got a few nice dopamine
Um,
hits seeing those words in your book. Yeah.
uh,
Oh yeah. Soft
Memories.
spot for Normal. Yeah.
maybe we should just pause there and say, did you go to grad school in
So I
ISU?
didn't. I
Did
went
you
to
go?
college at Illinois
Oh,
Wesleyan, the
okay.
overpriced private school that's in town. But then I went out to the East Coast to Rutgers for grad school.
Oh,
Okay.
cool.
So we did a podcast recording with Jim Plath,
Yeah.
who was from
Yeah.
Illinois
Oh my
Wesleyan,
God.
All right. Yeah.
and he's the president of the
Updike.
John
Yeah.
Updike
Yeah.
Society.
Wow.
So he came to the conference, I think, in
2017, I think.
2017, and we recorded with him and Charlie Harris. And then, like, a few months later, Charlie Harris passed away.
Wow.
So, but anyways, you being in Illinois there, there is some nice juxtaposition later in the book. I underlined a couple of phrases in the first. Actually, could you read the first like two or three couplets of um, that first
Yeah.
poem, the title
Totally.
poem?
Yeah.
Just, or as much of it
Yeah.
as you want to read, honestly. But there's a couple of phrases in there I underlined.
Yep. I'll read the first bit here. So this is Yaguareté White. No jaguars wander my father's village. No panthers patrol the cane fields caged in bamboo fences. Nestled among the Biturusu, what passes for a mountain range in Paraguay, the Cordillera Cawasu. You see, Spanish adjectives arrive after the noun they describe, clarifying notes that add color and context. There is history and then there is history, but there are no jaguars here. Only a pool of blood petrified into stone, a place I call home. Tierra de arcilla, clay so bright it stains orange.
That's
Lovely.
great. That's great. And the first thing I underlined there is actually about that phrase of what passes for a mountain range in
Mhm.
Paraguay.
Hmm.
And this gets to that sort of stepchild status that the country has, where it's not Brazil, it's not Argentina, it's not
Right.
Chile. It doesn't really have the mountains, it doesn't really have a coastline. But then later on in the book, you say something similar about
Hmm.
Illinois, and that Illinois is sort of a landlocked country and in its
Yeah.
own right. And it you have something like what passes for woods in
Yeah.
Illinois. So there's a nice sort of
Hmm.
symmetry there. I mean, do you think? I'm not saying like why did your dad end up in Illinois, but like were there similarities that you saw growing up? But I assume you've been back to
Oh yeah,
Paraguay
yeah.
since
We
you.
were.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
mean, I've been privileged enough to have traveled back every 3 or 4 years with my family. Oftentimes, it'd be the whole family. We'd go for like a month over winter break when we were really like younger.
And the first 2 weeks felt really long, you say, as
Yes.
like a teenager, right? Why is that?
Well, I mean, I'm starting to appreciate it more having a child now, right? Because like
Yeah.
a week of my kid's life is a significantly larger percentage of her lifespan
Percentage.
than like for
Yeah,
us,
than
right?
yours. Yeah.
So I think for my dad, going back a month was like minimum because he, like literally everyone's there. His whole family is there. And at the
Yeah.
time, until relatively recently, both his parents were still alive and his siblings and all that. And so for us to go down for a full month, always when we were kids, did feel like, oh my, it's like it doesn't end. We're still here.
Mm.
Which I look back on this now though, and I realize what a privilege that was to be able to travel like that.
Yeah.
And I don't not a lot of this is in the book, but I've been thinking a lot about how different the migratory experience is for my dad, but I think also for other immigrants from Paraguay. Like they don't walk, they can't drive, they can't take the train, La Bestia. They fly in most cases,
Hmm.
and like that's a bit of a privilege, but it's
Right.
also then kind of compounded by the fact that Paraguayans are one of, if not the smallest percentage of Latina Americans in the U.S.
Mm.
And so we're like a minoritized population within a minoritized population, even though in getting here didn't have to like struggle in those same ways. And so it's kind of a mind fuck in its own right. um,
Mm.
but Matt, when you say like I didn't appreciate how similar Central Illinois is to Paraguay until later, because yeah, he grew up on a farm in a village outside of a town, and then he actually went to high school. The Graham family hosted him as an exchange student in Gridley, Illinois. So it's like a village outside of a town in the middle of a cornfield. It took me a while to like look around and be like, oh my god, this is of course, this is where he landed and stayed
This
for the
makes
rest of his
sense.
life.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah,
funny.
that makes a lot of sense. And I want to go back to the sort of identity question there, and that even in that trip you just described, because I'm wondering on those sorts of occasions of you going to Paraguay, like, do you pass
Mhm.
as a Paraguayan half immigrant or as an American who is not there really speaking the language? And then when you come
Hmm.
back, do you feel Paraguayan? Um, but passing as white, like what is that sort of
Yeah,
identity
yeah,
there?
and that the passing also was a big part of that language. The word choices there in the opening poem and then the later poem about the Christmas trees, because it's like it's a thing that's sort of like another thing. You can kind of get away with it, but it's not really that thing. And the same was definitely true for our travels there. At least as kids, my brothers and I grew up in Bloomington without certainly without a Paraguayan American community, and we didn't really have a Latina American community, not really either. And so we didn't grow up speaking Spanish. We grew up with mostly white kids on the block, in the suburban block, and we were pretty conspicuously, the brown kids from Tu Cheviot. But then we go down to Paraguay, it would always be in the winter when we would be pasty white and there would be their summertime, and we would stand out for
The
like the reverse
contrast was
reasons,
marked.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I hadn't really thought about it that way, but coming back to the US, it was like a reverse culture shock, but not really, because that's where we came from, right? But the reverse culture shock of coming back to the States and landing in snowfall and winter. We'd been gone for a month, so now we were all tan and dark.
Yeah.
And nowadays, or I guess the last time I was down there was right, like literally right before the pandemic shut everything down. Like I landed back in the States March 1st or whatever, and by the end of that week we had canceled
Wow.
classes and Chicago had a
Mm.
lockdown and all that. And so I got one last trip in And it isn't so much the reverse. Like the culture shock is no longer that much of a thing now that I'm a grown up. But the reconnecting to that sense of family and home and culture is so much more profound, because it just carries all the weight of the memories and the family. And now as I age, as family ages, other folks have passed away, and you can kind of see like how the ties to not just the culture, but it's literally the people who we are related to down there. Like my child hasn't been. I intend to take her in the next couple of years or so when she can really remember it and absorb it. But we're not going to be going down every 3 to 4 years. I hope to go
Mhm.
more than once. But like, it's just different when your parent is the one who's from there, because they then
Yeah.
kind of take the helm in communication and navigation, like everything, you know. And
Right.
so now that
Yeah.
that's on me in many ways, which is wild, which is just wild.
This kind of reminds me of the poem Autonym on page 21, where you're talking about your daughter. She sees people and she says people, and then but eventually she'll turn to me and ask, "What do we call ourselves?" Then how should I reply? Are we the X in Latinx, the at in Latina, mongrel and mestizo both, but Americano? Dios, anything but that. Like God, anything but American.
Yeah, yeah,
It's part of the identity, sort of navigation, negotiation stuff at work
yes,
here. So you think about like, yeah, heritage, nationality. What is how is this defined for us and for our family? Yeah,
yeah,
that's a
exactly.
really
And having to admit, because I had a friend read it, the same friend who had mentioned apophatic traditions, kind of question that last line, kind of question it and be like,
mm,
well, but shouldn't you gesture to the fact that it is the case, like you and your children, or the speaker and their children, whatever they are, growing up in the US, they are Americans.
yeah, yeah,
And I kind of pushed back, and I wanted to stick with that one, because it's supposed to be a little funny, it's supposed to be kind of a humorous line. The poem's
yeah,
all about
yeah.
like, oh, we need to connect to people more, we need more metaphor, but then like, oh, no, no, no,
Yes.
we're not that thing. But also the book, I hope, tries to, yeah, like you say, complicate notions of what it even means to be American or
Hmm.
Americano or whatever, and to kind of unpack that. And this isn't in the book, but this came from one, I think, sometimes we get these core memories or experiences when we're young, and they just really inform like our thinking about the world. Like so many years ago, like 20, 30 years ago, my dad made a comment because I said something about like, I don't even remember if I asked him like what it felt like to come to America or whatever for the first time.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
his response was like, he's like, I've always been from America. And I remember
Oh,
that because I was like,
interesting.
oh
Well,
snap, because my dad's not like, I don't know, he's not super, I don't know, progressive or whatever, but to say something like
yeah.
that, I was like, oh shit, you're right, like I guess it's all it is all America, isn't it? And that really
Hmm.
stuck with me, because I was like, oh wow, you conceptualize this even differently than I imagined, than I perhaps thought that you had. So that was an interesting awakening. Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, and there's, sort of white person tendency to think of America as just United States of America. And obviously, if you travel to Central America or South America or other, even in Mexico, there are people who have very strong feelings that there is more to America than just the United States of America. And even when I was looking up the Guarani language, it's classified as an American
Mm-hmm.
language, meaning a language of the Americas, of which there were thousands of indigenous, languages before they were wiped
Right.
out. So that idea of America, I thought, was very brilliant, actually, to put that into that poem. Just because there's so much
Mm-hmm.
baggage on that term, and and identity based mainly being like white settlers
Yeah.
versus
Mm-hmm.
indigenous people, which is also kind of at the core of the national identity, I would say, of
Mm-hmm.
Paraguay, or at least going back into the 17th
Mm-hmm.
century,
Mm-hmm.
at least. Um, and I wanted to, one of my favorite poems in this book is the comprehensive list of famous fictional Paraguayans.
Yeah, that's funny.
I love that list because I think it's not something I've ever seen like assembled in there, but like when I was going through it, I was like, oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah, this is great, and it's really like pop culture, but also um, films and books that have used Paraguay for their purposes, and that's in a way you're adding to your own lists
Yeah,
putting
that's true. And there's
yourself
that
in
note in
there.
the
So
forward that you're the first Paraguayan American poet to publish in English ever in the U.S. So that's a pretty cool.
it's just
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
yeah,
crazy.
crazy. But it's pretty
It's
cool that you
crazy.
get
But I
to
mean,
like do that moon landing. You know.
yeah. I've been thinking a little bit about. I mean, I'm very proud of that. I'm also very grateful. The Rigoberto, who wrote the forward, has been a mentor of
Mm,
mine for a long time,
cool.
and so it's like a great privilege and pleasure to publish with University of Arizona Press. And I've been thinking about why that is, because like there's lots of Chicano poets, there's lots of Dominican American poets, there's lots of Puerto Rican and New Yorker. Like you fill in the blank. There's some of them about, and some more than others. And I've been thinking a lot about that. And when I think about the Paraguayans, I know mostly through my dad, but now I'm meeting more. I'm meeting more Paraguayan Americans as well, sort of through
Hmm.
literary circles. It's not actually that surprising because most Paraguayans who come over don't have the luxury, I guess, of pursuing the kinds of literary fields that I found myself in, and I don't, and I
Mm,
like it casts a new light on some of the decisions I made, and also some of the pushback that I had early on, like in college, being, I wouldn't say required, but strongly encouraged by my father to take an economics class. And I'm sure it was interesting. Like I think
yeah.
I think now I would appreciate it, but at the time I didn't know what I was. I was not doing the
Yeah.
assignments or the reading. It was so dry. I just wanted to read poems and literature, or whatever. And I
My
did
dad
that.
pushed me into business school right after high school. I was like, I don't know what I am interested in. I don't.
Yeah.
I found out very quickly it was not business. I got 35% in accounting, so I hear
Right?
you.
Yeah. But that's coming from somewhere. That's not coming from
Yeah.
anything other than like,
right.
I think this would be good for you because like this is what I know. My dad didn't know
Hmm.
shit about poetry or publishing books. No one in my
Mine
family
neither.
did. And I think that that's true for most Paraguayans and Paraguayan Americans is they don't
Okay.
get the kinds of
Yeah.
jobs that require reading and writing for a living.
Right.
Well, and most of those in popular cultural representation, like you're putting in that poem, are working as cooks and cleaners
Mhm.
and landscaping, or background as, maybe in the drug cartel or something. Um, my favorite is that joke from Bottle Rocket, which you list in here, where Luke Wilson falls in love with the maid, and he's like, "Wow, you have a lovely accent. What part of Mexico are you from?" And she's Paraguay. And like, it just kills me. But it's just so perfect too for like white people just assuming that a
Right.
Latina is from
Yeah. Yeah.
Mexico.
That's so
They
American,
just
right?
had
Such an
no idea. He's
American
like, "Wow,
assumption. Yeah.
Paraguay." Okay, never met anyone
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
Paraguay. So that, I mean, that being just a further evidence of like the small stature of the country, even on a global stage, the sort of
Hmm.
forgottenness of it. And really, even for well educated people who have degrees in literature, never heard of
Mhm.
Guarani, never heard of it as a written language or used in poetry. So it is something very new that you're doing here. It feels like it. Does it feel that way to you, that this is like there's not a lot of forebears for you
It
in this?
does. It does. I think that I'm most conscious of it though in the foregrounding of the whiteness. Like
Mm.
there's certainly the Guarani and the Paraguayan piece and all that. Which is fascinating and interesting as someone who like lives it, but also am just genuinely I learn a lot more too as I as I think a couple times in the book I refer to like learning this a lot of it from the internet and from Wikipedia and from Google searches. And
Mm.
it's weird to have like my primary source of information for kind of who I am and where I came from being my dad, who is not
Yeah.
super reliable as a source of information, which is fine. Like people, I'll text him and ask for how do you spell X, Y, or Z? Like how do you spell this word
Mm.
Guarani? And he'll send me back whatever. And that's what ended up in the book. I look online and like the more formally accepted spelling is totally different. It's completely different. But I'm like, oh, this is how I learned it, so this is what's going to go into the book.
Yeah, that's cool. I like that.
As far as the like
Well,
the foregrounding the whiteness part of it feels also very important to me because um that it would feel disingenuous to pretend like that's not also part of where I come from, and then also where
Hmm.
by extension many of the speakers are speaking from in the book. And we'll see. I don't know, that's the part that makes me the most nervous, I think, because with whiteness comes certain traditions of like I mentioned earlier, appropriation or exploitation and even like oppression and silencing and stuff. And so to try to do both felt tricky. It also felt necessary because like I'm not sure how else to do it right.
Hmm.
well, and there are poets who I think, and you fall into this category, that they're I don't know, creative energy is inherently tied up with
Mm,
politics in some way, and that your creative energy is very much about, um, it feels very much tied up with
mhm,
representation,
mhm,
right? And that you're also concerned about, the identity part of it alone. Like if you really care about identity, then where you land on some of these issues is going to be fairly
mm,
obvious in my experience. And so I do have some questions for you about uh, basic white people like myself who don't have this experience of growing up with any kind of real racial
mm,
identity at all. And I mean, that's clearly you made it. You've said that that's kind of who you grew up around,
mhm,
right? Was probably white people who had no concept of race other than white being the
mhm.
default, right? So you have a pretty scathing poem in here called Basic White People, right? Basic
Basic
White.
White.
What was the
Mhm.
title of
Yeah,
it?
Basic
basic
White.
white.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Page 72.
it's do you want to talk to us a little bit about that poem? Because it's like, you hear it often with like even like paint colors, right? Like it's just a basic white, or with
But
like
mixed up with like
our
basic
our
bitch, that kind of
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right, like basic white girl, like, and it's like not even considered like a racial slur, really. It's just sort of a default
Mhm.
mode. But what was your thinking behind that
Yeah,
poem?
so that poem basically did very much come from sort of the sources where you two have identified. It is meant to be derogatory on the one hand,
Yeah.
and it's supposed to echo some of the other. There's like some color play throughout. One of the poems is called Himmelblau, which is blue and like light like sky blue in German, and there's that echoes some other parts of the book. But this poem in particular used to be a lot longer, and I wrote it very much as almost like a actually it was, I wrote it very much as a protest poem, because the first time I read it in a much longer, much messier uh, form was at a poetry reading here in Chicago at a bar, like right after Trump's election, first election
Mm,
for posterity. Oh God,
that's
it was
good
right
timing
after
for
his
reading this
election.
poem.
Bunch of poets getting together and just reading like angry poems, and that's what it was. I didn't come
Oh
back
yeah.
to it until I was kind of finalizing the book and realizing like I needed to like tidy it up a little bit. I cut it down from like 8 or 9 pages to whatever it is now, 3, 4, or 5 or whatever.
And it's the longest poem in the book, I think, right?
It's easily the
Yeah.
longest poem in the
Yeah.
book,
Yeah.
and I still felt weird about it right up until I had sent it off to the publishers for like final approval, but a friend had helped me think about it as like maybe the most significant poem that asserts what is, as opposed to so many of the poems talking about what is not or what's lacking or what's missing. This one is very much, I mean, it follows the same format, right? It's like it is this, it is this, it is this, and it's supposed to be a little funny. It's supposed to be a little scathing, and it's also supposed to be a little bit of the book's sort of consciousness turning on itself a little bit.
Hmm.
I had a lot of fun writing it, and I have to be careful though where I read it, because sometimes it lands really really well, and other times it kind of just it's confusing, I think. So I need to deploy it with care.
There's certain parts of Texas where if you read this, it would either A, enrage people to gun violence, or B, just like go way over their heads. I don't know.
Exactly,
Maybe both.
exactly. Yeah.
But in certain states in the US, I think you're pretty safe to read this and everyone would be like, yeah, totally.
Yes. Yeah.
Can you want to read us like a few lines from
Yeah.
this to give
Yeah,
us like a sample of what we're talking about?
Yep.
There's so
Absolutely.
many parts that I could pick that are so apt here. Part about
um.
Tesla is really
you
good.
pick.
Yeah. I'll read like the first page or so.
Cool.
This is Basic White. Basic White is so basic, right? Basic White is double speak for supremacy. Basic White enshrines individual liberty. Basic White lives for private property. Basic White takes what it wants when it wants it. Basic White bleeds what it needs to survive. Basic White includes you, if you like. Basic White j'adores yoga, tacos, head dressing. Basic White buys overpriced merchandise from its sports teams. Basic White hangs Indians, Redskins, and Braves on its racks. Basic White calls Basic White business back. Basic White hosts the Zoom call, crowdsources, starts up. Basic White co-work, happy hour, foosball. Basic White tablet, dual screen, laptop. Basic White salary, medical and dental. Basic White annual physical exam. Basic White braces and corrective lenses. Basic White migraine the size of a school bus. Basic White blue light lens flare up. Basic White meditate and Basic White smile. Basic White hit send on the Outlook invite. Basic White agenda action item KPI. Basic White makes the ass, gauges bandwidth, talks offline, and it goes on.
I thought it was
It's
really
so
funny.
funny. It's so I just see I just see moments of myself in this and just cringe. Like it does the job really well.
Well, you guys are both teachers,
Yeah.
but like I feel like there's a fair amount of like just white corporate,
Yes.
which is the
Yeah.
default. Like, do you have experience in that world or finance, a corporate, or
My
anything
first
like
job out
that?
of college, I worked for my uncle, white uncle. He's actually in the poem, but he has a different name. At their web design company, and I learned a lot. I learned way more than in that econ class that I probably passed, but it was like for a year, and it's another one of those things where my aunt and uncle had this web design company. They built websites for like Chicago Symphony Orchestra and other big venues where they really pioneered a ticketing software or whatever. I don't know a whole lot about it anymore. But they gave me the job, they gave me a place to stay, and I learned a lot. I learned just so much about how to work with other people and clients and like money and budgets and stuff that I had no clue about having a degree in English. And I also then quickly realized that this is not what I want to do with my life. I'm not good at it. I don't care about it. And so that's when I applied to grad school and went to school. But so I hate to say this, man, but the other bookend of that. So that's where it kind of started. The other bookend of it is having been in particular environments in higher ed and hearing all this same nonsense in very long meetings
Mhm.
where very little happens, and there's why are there so many people in this room, what like so it's supposed to be. I mean, the poem takes some liberties, right? Because like, can you call corporate culture like white? I mean, I think so. It's not that simple. It's not that
Mhm.
straightforward. It's more complicated than that. But I do think there is power in calling it that thing in order to then to either start a conversation or, as the poem does, try to kind of trace a line between some of the silly nonsense of corporate speak to some of the more sinister instantiations of white supremacy
Mhm.
culture, which kind of happened a
Yeah.
little bit later with sort of the violence and etc.
Well, in institutional
Yeah.
racism, I'm thinking that there's institutions are so good at these administrative tasks, these bureaucracy structures where, I was also thinking well, one, higher ed for sure has just ballooned in the amount of bureaucracy and administration that is involved in the money making sort of corporatization of the whole process. But also going back to Paraguay, like I think this is why the Spaniards were successful in colonizing almost every Latin American country, was that they were really good at administration and putting up a lot of bureaucracy and putting up a lot of institutions. I was reading about one particular kind of like monastery that they would build
Mm.
in Paraguay that was like a school, a church, a government, and it was like all in one building. And this became like all of these institutions, which didn't really exist with like a, you know, loosely organized sort of farming hunting community, right? Like they didn't have separate buildings for all of these things. And so this sort of administration that the Spaniards brought was really that form of
Yeah.
colonization.
Mm-hmm.
So I I was impressed that I, I asked that question. I figured you had to have had some kind of a job that was just mind numbing in its corporate meetings and processes and all of that corporate speak. So not a lot of academics have that, and I mean maybe they do now just working in academia,
Yeah.
but I actually think it's really valuable to even if it forces you to run for the
Yeah.
hills. I think
I mean, part
it's
part of my
valuable
job now, I
experience.
teach at the city colleges, which is you cannot extricate it from the city of Chicago. Like I am a city employee
Right.
essentially,
Okay. Yeah.
and that comes with a lot of benefits, but it also comes with a lot of problems because as an individual college, we cannot actually do that much. Everything has to be run up and down a pole,
Mm.
and it's tough because I wouldn't maybe I'll have a different job in the future, but the students I work with, their lives are so interesting and they're just the people who are most deserving of a quality education. It's regularly difficult to square that commitment with the bullshit. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, and it's just lack of
Yeah.
independence, I mean, and that's what I feel about nation states too, is like you have this other sort of institution bearing or mixed up in your business. And it's very rare actually these days to find an institution. We were talking about libraries on a previous episode because I'm on the board of a library that is truly independent, one of only 13 in Texas that's not a division of a city or a
Mm.
school or some other institution. And like I had worked at university presses before in New York, one of which was like housed in the Department of
Whoa.
Libraries. And it was like, makes no sense at all, right? But you're just like, well, you could be placed. What if the city colleges now reports up through the city
Mm-hmm.
manager? It's like, I don't know. It makes no sense at all. But you're in this sort of corporate, I don't know.
Matrix.
I'm trying to think of the right word. Yeah, like Matrix, right? And so I think you having that experience, it does feel like that is. Would you say that is tied to some kind of racial identity as
Yeah,
well?
absolutely. And I hope that
Yeah.
the book is able to to leverage that language in a way that reflects the white supremacist culture where that I think a lot of this from which a lot of this derives, but also tries to complicate it a bit. In terms of, like you were saying, Matt, like, so yeah, when the Jesuits colonized Paraguay, like they instituted practices and actual infrastructure that has forever changed the course of what wasn't even a country yet. Like those people who lived there forever changed the
Yeah.
course of their lives and future generations, etc. And so to
Mhm.
try to, it can be tricky. I'm not the only poet to do this, but to kind of trace that back, and either in search of, I don't know if it's in search of origin or maybe truth, I guess, if not facts, because sometimes facts are also confusing. But to try to then I guess combine it all without it being too terribly overwhelming or messy in a book of poetry, which, for they're pretty small by definition. Um, like I said, though, I kind of felt like I wanted to get this together and put it out so that it can be its thing, and then I can kind of go from there. Because I don't think I'm done. Like, there's a lot that didn't make it into the book that I hope to explore one day in other poems. Like, one of the courtesans slash partners of one of the dictators in early colonial Paraguay was a woman named Eliza Lynch, and she's Irish, and that's happens to be my mom's, her family's last name, her family name, and they are also Irish. And I was like, what are the odds that a Lynch would go down to Paraguay centuries
Yeah.
before we would? I was like, that's nuts. I got to write about that, but I
Oh,
didn't
well,
really
that's
in this book.
wild.
Do you think you're related
I mean,
to
probably.
them?
I don't know.
Probably.
That's one of the poem
Probably.
titles,
Go
right?
back far
Lynch.
enough.
What is it? Lynch
Lynch
Christmas or
Christmas.
Lynch?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Which made me think of like David Lynch right away, and then I had terrifying thoughts about what a Lynchian Christmas could look like. But
The Lynch family Christmas. Yeah, special.
yeah, National Lampoons meets Eraserhead or something.
In that poem, though, about the fictional representations of famous
Mm.
Paraguayans, I wanted to ask if there were any like good portrayals of Paraguay, or could you recommend any other like Paraguayan writers to us?
So part of what I've tried to do just on my own is educate myself in that regard. I did learn that there's a Paraguayan American poet named C.E. Wallace. Interesting, Wallace. She's in New York, and
Mm.
she has agreed to join me for a virtual launch party or like a launch event via Zoom for the book on
Oh,
February
cool.
20th. And so that'll be cool. But I didn't, the only reason we connected was because before, as the book was sort of coming together, I thought I was advised to kind of get my social media presence back up and like coherent somewhat. So I spent like weeks and weeks
Yeah.
doing that, and whatever. So there we are now. But I did discover this person. I was like, oh shit, there's like there's someone else. Like let's connect. Um, and I'll have at an event in Chicago on the 22nd. That's the Thursday following. I've hired a harpist to play some Paraguayan music because I
Oh,
don't know
cool.
how much this really made it into the book, but I've been thinking about it a lot lately. The I grew up listening to Paraguayan music and Christian rock, and the Paraguayan music, it was like all my dad would blast on Saturday mornings when we do chores or whatever, and I hated it. Every song sounded the same. It was all accordions and guitars and harps, and no thank you. But now,
And then your mom's rocking like Petra in the minivan or something.
yes, yeah, dude, yes,
The white
so
minivan.
much bad rock. It's just like, just make us whatever. That's gonna take a whole like a therapy session to unpack my
Yes, I have
yeah,
some
Christian
experience
rock.
with this too. Yeah, Christian trauma.
I grew up
Yeah.
with Christian rap, so we could talk
Oh
about
yeah, that
this
too.
too. So.
DC
But
talk.
now, now I tell you what's on my Spotify is I've come back to discover a lot of these songs from Paraguay, and I'm like, oh, these are actually quite beautiful. Yeah, like Heart. And so it's taken a while to come back around and appreciate I mean, the harp is
Mm.
incredible. I did not appreciate how hard it is to play that instrument, and so I'm excited to like have someone play that. Yeah.
That's nuts. It's very unwieldy.
The part about other poets and other writers, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about creativity. Like, we've talked about a lot about the experiences you've had growing up, and sort of even going to Paraguay and having this sort of split identity growing up in rural Illinois. Like, can you talk about the sort of creative urge that you had to take that experience and put it into a poem? I believe that anyone can write, anyone can create, just like anyone can cook food, right? Like, some better than others, but that creative urge where you're like, man, I want to sit down and write about this. Can you talk to us a
Mm-hmm.
little bit about how this sort of came out
Mm-hmm.
and expressed itself, going back 15 years, or even in the past? Probably
Oh yeah,
changed
yeah,
significantly
for
for you in the
sure.
past 2 or 3 years.
I mean, I remember very clearly the two, I guess, first, maybe not strongest, but first literary, I would call them literary influences that I remember, because it was seventh grade, and I was finally like, I had my Discman, and I was able to kind of explore my own
Oh
tastes.
yeah.
And so I was listening. I probably shouldn't have been. I don't know how old. I guess 12. I would have been 12, 13. Listening to Eminem, Eminem's very first album, and really being blown away by the rhyme schemes and the wordplay. And again, probably shouldn't have listened. There's some questionable messaging in those, but still, also then being in language arts class, which they used to call language arts. I don't know if they still do. Reading,
They still do.
yeah,
Yeah, I hear that
we would
once in a
read.
while
I
too.
remember very clearly reading Edgar Allan Poe and just appreciating like, oh, you can put rhymes at the end and in the middle and in between, and you can like echo sounds all throughout. It blew my mind. And so I wrote dozens and dozens of pages, which were just, they were somewhere between a rap lyric and Edgar Allan Poe, I guess, just all
The
end
Raven.
rhymed, just on and on and
Yeah.
on.
Telltale harp.
And that that felt very authentic. It felt very liberatory because I could just like put the words down on the page. And as a young person with something to say, it was nice to have an outlet. It really wasn't until college, and then especially grad school, where I discovered forms and something even more empowering and freeing and challenging about the constraints of poetic forms, forcing different forms of creativity or different forms different like ways around those constraints, right? And without that, I know for sure I wouldn't have been able to do most of what has come together in the book. um and I've been able to really explore like you had mentioned the prose poems before, and the prose poems, I think it took me a while to realize this, but I think a lot of the more like formally prose poems came from trying to kind of separate out or square out experiences that felt separated from me or that did not feel like I had access to. And so I was going to just write them in this very constrained like look, I guess it's a form, but the shape on the page. And then being able to experiment that and see how can I break that apart, because some of the prose poems sort of start to disintegrate. Some of them then become just single lines, mono stitch stanzas. And I wouldn't, the shape of the
Somewhere in the shape
submarine,
of a
yep, which
submarine.
I had one of the I don't know if it's a typesetter or what you call them now because it's all digital, but they sent a note back pretty late on
Mm.
with a note that was like,
Compositor.
does it need to be oriented on the side? Can't we just do it vertically? And I was like, no, 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 absolutely not. It needs
Oh
to
yeah.
be on the side. So I'm like, okay, rotate. Yeah. Yeah.
That's an artist right there. And that, I think that does make it more interesting when you're flipping through it. Um,
Absolutely. Yeah,
Hmm.
this book's very visually arresting, and
Hmm.
and the cover as well. My son, who's been obsessed by this cover all week with the like man wearing an animal on his head, like he just can't understand this concept and he just keeps pointing to it. Can you walk us through the cover a little bit? It's such a gorgeous
Yes,
cover. I
I am
really like this
so
object.
happy with how the cover art came together. I had
Yeah, it's awesome.
I knew I wanted my only criteria, and then how it ends up is wild. My only criteria was I want it to pop. I need it to be interesting to look at. I read a lot of poetry. I love most of the poetry that I read. We need, as a community, we need to work on our covers because most of them, you look at it, you wouldn't even look at it once. You just look right past it. Um, but so that was my only criteria. So I went to Google and I Googled Yaguareté, enter. and got some jaguars, whatever, in Google Images, and found though also some art, a lot of art, like dozens and dozens of pieces by Alan Barry Reese, and he does this sort of it's kind of pulpy, like comic book sort of style, and one of them,
Hmm.
well, I
Yeah.
found several of them that I really liked that featured jaguars pretty prominently, and so I reached out to his people, I guess, or his representation, and I was just like, hey, can we use one of these for the cover of my book? I don't have much money. Like, I'd have a budget of $0, but I could try to work something out. And they got back, and he, the artist, Alan, had actually suggested um, this piece in particular. And it was originally oriented horizontally and had some different iconography around it that got swapped out. But he suggested this one. And so he reoriented it, added some stuff, obviously my name and whatever. And I didn't find out until I had actually gotten these printed arcs with some of the the symbolism behind it. I just thought it looked cool. But if you'll notice in some of the corners, it's telling a story. It's telling a very specific story. It's telling the
Yeah.
story of Yaguareté Aba, which is like it's like a werewolf but with jaguars, right? So it's like the way the story goes is a native person in Paraguay who has been blessed by the missionaries acquires these powers, these shamanic powers, to like witch doctor powers, to turn into a jaguar, and
Mm.
can turn into an like a shapeshifter. In order to kill the jaguar man, you have to use it's bonkers. You have to use either a blessed machete, so a machete that's been blessed, or a bullet that's
Oh
been
yeah, there's
blessed.
the holy water
Hmm.
sprinkling on
Yeah,
it. Okay,
yeah. And
yeah.
then after one kills the jaguar man, you have to kill yourself by decapitating yourself. I was like, that just
Oh
seems
wow.
unnecessary. That's so extra. But to learn after the fact that there's this whole mythology baked right into what I just thought was some cool looking art, it, number one, it means I like big props and trust in the artist, the visual artist, to
Mhm.
choose the right piece. But then also I just feel so fortunate that, number one, I think it looks cool, but also it tells a whole other story that I wasn't even prepared to be part of the book itself. um
That's great. I'm glad I asked.
yes, I am too. So wild.
One of my last questions for you, I wrote this down thinking we would get to maybe more of this. We haven't really got into a lot of it, but maybe this question will spur on some of it, which is just, do you have any advice for white people on how to be better? Like, this is it's a very broad question, but like in the context of not just your book and the issues that it brings up, but and I'm not saying like white people are the bad people here, because you're half white yourself. It's complex,
Yeah.
but the that's my
How to be
question.
less
Do you have
basic.
advice for white people on how to be good ally, but also like, you know do the right thing? Like, I don't know what I'm really
Yeah, for
asking here,
sure.
but like, tell
First
me
of all, I
what
do
would your
think of
advice be?
myself as all white and all Paraguayan, right? I think a lot about. No, 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 not at all, not at all. I
That's
think
interesting.
that's what most
Sorry
people
for
say,
saying
but it has
half
always
white
struck me
then.
as strange. It's like
Mm.
people who are biracial aren't like half and half. They get it each from both, but they are all of each, right? And so, and like for my daughter, I mean, this is little in the book, but for my daughter, she is all Paraguayan. She's all white. She's also all Jewish, and she's going to have a
Hmm.
whole different journey ahead of her navigating all
Hmm.
that nonsense. But
Yeah, no kidding.
right,
We'll look forward to her book of poetry in
yeah,
25 to
called "My
35
Dad's
years that
Confusing."
explores all this.
um, I think the best one of the most eye opening things that I was able to do, even as someone who, I mean, I identify as a person of color, but I'm also a white person, is to understand that white is a racialized category itself. Like, we're so often just believe that white is default, and like there are people of color and minoritized populations, but in fact, white is a race. It was created. I highly recommend The Creation of the White Race, a book written, oh God, was it in the 60s or 70s, which puts forward a pretty interesting thesis, which is that capitalism created white people because it was easier to bond, Irish and Italian and Lithuanians together than against,
Mhm.
at the time, African and African American and Black folks, um, and to kind of pit those parties against one another.
Mm.
But so, yeah, and I think the other thing that I just think in general most white people need to do is be a little less precious when confronted, and have the audacity to say, yeah, I get that, I understand why systemically and structurally these are big problems that I benefit from
Mm-hmm.
personally and culturally and familially, and it actually is my responsibility to do something about that. I feel
Mm-hmm.
like perhaps probably your audience will already be thinking along those lines, but it is something that I continue to think about and wrestle with, and hope to also share, especially with like students and younger folks as well, but also just like my family and people I know, because not everybody has done that kind of thinking, and I do think it is important.
Mm-hmm.
I think actually it's crucial. Yeah.
Well, and this moment that we're living in right now is one in which, DEI departments are being dismantled across the country, really for out of a reason that sounds like something I thought we had progressed past in the past 30 years, which
Mm.
is sort of like charges of reverse racism, which is just so like middle school argument, that like people who literally have not thought about this more than reading a headline on something and we're like, oh yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
reverse race. It's like, really, that's what you're going to go with? But that's a lot of the reasoning for taking down DEI departments right now. So I bring this up partly because I felt, even going back before 2020, before even
Mm,
Ferguson, that there's
yeah.
there's enemies out there. Like, there's people who are actively,
Yeah.
and you mentioned Charlottesville in the book, and like there are actual like growing racist forces that are trying to recruit people over in a PR war. So I think that that's good advice, to be more educated, well read. I feel like it's sort of like, yeah, we're preaching to the choir in some ways, but also like the progress we've made, it feels like we've gone back.
Sort of
I don't know if you
regression.
feel
Totally.
that way, but I felt like in the past few years we've taken a lot of steps back,
Mm,
and I'm hopeful. You mentioned hope too, and I am hopeful that we can take. Things don't go linear, right? They go back and then they go forward again. I'm hopeful that we go forward again, but um, it's really hard right
yeah.
now, especially
Yeah.
in places
No.
like
No.
Texas. But
No, absolutely
Illinois is
not.
not immune to it either. Canada's not immune to it. There's
Hmm.
racist people in every city, country, state in the world. So um, this has been great. That was basically where I wanted to land on, and not that like I go around asking poets for advice.
Mm,
I do turn to poetry a lot. I read a lot of poetry for consolation, for inspiration,
mm,
for information, but don't write it myself. So I really enjoyed this style of writing. Like, again,
mm,
I like anything that's like
Totally.
hard to categorize, and like we've just been calling it
mm.
poetry, but like I actually think it's more complex than that. So I hope people do
Yes.
go out and pick up the book and read it for themselves, because I think there's a lot. Not only would you learn a lot about Paraguayan culture and food and language, but also
Mm.
it's just
It
fun.
is.
Like, it's a
I'm
It's
fun
glad to
book
hear
to
that.
read.
in terms of like a final question or a final thought from me, there's a lot about fatherhood in this book
Mm,
that goes both ways, like your own father and being a father. You got some moments about your own father, like poor another and another, to
mm,
this day, another. And then you chronicle, I think with your brother, the sort of a drunken flight to Paraguay, where you're just like barfing in between the between the window seat and your own seat from just day drinking, like, and then like how generational stuff and fathers and all that stuff. I mean, that's a big theme in Infinite Jest, of course,
mhm,
and you have one poem titled "Manger Made by
mm,
Hands" in this book,
mhm.
page 78. I assume that's a reference to Wallace's "Church Not Made with Hands" from brief interviews.
It's certainly
Do you
an
want? Can you
echo.
speak a bit more
Yeah.
about your thoughts
He's like,
on
no, it's not.
fatherhood both ways? Certainly.
Yeah, no, no, it is. I'm glad you. I was gonna, as one of my like sign offs, I wanted to bring it back
Yeah.
to Wallace a little bit, because yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
pretty far removed from most of what he was writing about. I mean, whiteness is there,
Sure.
but yeah, the
Yeah.
manger
Yeah.
made by hands. Yeah, there's definitely an echo. And actually, I actually thought you were gonna mention a poem. I gotta memorize the page numbers. There's one, yeah, San Francisco Potrero, where the two women go and visit the cemetery. That
Oh yeah. Yeah.
portion,
Hmm.
or that is a prose poem, that one I modeled actually very, very closely off of one of the opening passages in the Pale King.
Hmm.
There's it's very similar. I kind of, I swapped out some of the language, but I tried to keep the sentence structure. This was an old one I wrote a long, long time ago when I was actually
Oh,
trying to
cool.
learn how to write prose. I was taking passages, early passages that were published online or elsewhere from the Pale King, and kind of mimicking the sentence structure, because what he does in those, I feel like what he does in a lot of those passages is like he's freed up to, like, it's like a different kind of syntax that he's worked out, and I was just mesmerized by it, and I tried to imitate it here. And then some of the Q&A, so there's, I mean, they're like joke poems, I guess. They're sort of dark jokes, with the Google Translate or whatever, the kind of the Q&As. I did very much borrow the ellipses, in place of any kind of response from interviews
Mm-hmm.
as well.
Which Wallace actually borrowed from Manuel Puig,
Yeah, there you go.
Latin
See, we come
American.
full
Oh,
circle
right.
back to Latin America. There we go. Yeah.
There you go.
And that opening of the Pale King, it was kind of a hobby horse of mine to say that I'm not really sure Wallace intended for that to be part of the Pale King. That
Mm,
was a
Mm.
decision by Michael Peach, and it was published. There are two of them published under the titles of Peoria in
mhm,
the journal Agni. So very much as like prose poems,
mhm,
and I have no idea that he had any idea of including those in a novel. I think it works
mm,
great, and I definitely think it's some of the more poetic stuff he's ever written. So I'm
mhm.
really happy to hear that. You being an Illinois kid, like it's
Yeah,
basically an ode to Illinois. So
yeah.
I was reading, your poem is sort of an ode, um, in a way. And there's
Mhm,
you mentioned like other poems like an anthem. So you got a lot going on in this short, even though it's like 100 and something
Mhm.
pages. It's a lot
yeah.
going on.
I hope it's not too much. I hope it's not too
No, no,
much.
no, no, no. I
Oh
I
no,
like it. I mean,
it's very manageable.
I
Good,
think that's what
good.
art should be: is ornamentation
Mm,
and detail, and how much can you fit into a page. That's one of the great things of poetry, is
mm.
packing a lot of meaning and emotion into a very small space. So I meant it as a pure compliment.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. Thanks, man.
Well,
Um,
this has been great. So you mentioned that you're going to be back on social media in some way. Where can people find you? Do you recommend people buy the book? I'm assuming through like bookshop or some local bookstore. Order
well,
it.
so glad you asked. So glad you asked. The best thing anybody could do is go to their local bookshop, their local independent bookshop, or their local Barnes and Nobles if you still got one around. Ask specifically for Yaguareté White. You'll probably have to spell it because it's hard to pronounce.
Yeah,
Um,
bring the ISBN number with you,
yeah, let me just rattle
Just
that off
show
real quick.
them the printout of
which is
the.
970.
um, yeah, and I'll be doing some virtual readings and other like appearances and stuff. I don't really have a book tour because I don't can't afford it, but I'll be around doing stuff. I do hope to make it to Austin at some point. Was good. I was. This is a side note. I promise we're wrapping up here. I was gonna go down to Austin this year for the Grand Prix, because since the
F1. Yeah.
pandemic, I have become obsessed with Formula One, and I
Wow.
can't tell if it's
Oh,
if it's
interesting.
authentic or if I just needed something to grab onto. But I like went
Yeah,
deep
yeah.
down the rabbit hole of that. So I almost went,
Oh,
and then I didn't. But maybe next year. Maybe next year.
I'd love to go
what
out
was the
there.
catalyst for that? What got you into it?
The Netflix show Drive to Survive.
I was gonna ask. Yeah, okay. I haven't watched that yet, but it's been recommended to me a lot
It
lately.
is. It's got a ridiculous. It's a stupid name for a show. That's why I avoided it for
Sure.
like a
Yeah.
year. But then once you watch it,
Yeah.
they do such a good job of making characters out of everybody involved that I was just
Hmm.
immediately engrossed. And I happened to then follow it in real time, the 2021 season, which ended up being one of the most controversial, arguably the most entertaining season
Hmm.
in decades. And that was my intro. I was
Well,
like, wow, I'm hooked. This is great.
yeah. Okay. Right time.
Yeah.
I did
Uh,
really like the Senna documentary, Ayrton Senna.
I haven't seen that yet. I need to
I
watch
have
that.
not watched that
That's
yet.
a fantastic documentary, and it's he died. It came out in like 2010 or something, so it's kind of about the 80s and 90s, but it is
Hmm.
fantastic story of that guy. So I was like on the verge of what you're saying now, of like I could go down this rabbit hole. I could get
Yeah.
really into Formula One, and since they've built the Circuit of the Americas in Austin, there's a number of people in Austin who were sort of on the border of like, oh, I'll watch any kind of competitive race, and then they're just like, okay, I'm going,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
they have a thing where you can drive your car on the track and stuff, and like they have all kinds of
That
other
seems
events
way
out
better than
there.
NASCAR, right?
Oh
NASCAR
yeah.
seems so
Oh
boring.
Yeah.
yeah.
Just hundreds of laps.
Stock
Trash.
car
What?
racing.
Trash.
Anyways, well, if you do ever come down here to the Grand Prix, would love to see you in Austin.
Oh yeah.
We have a great.
Thank you guys. This has been awesome. This has been really great.
You're so welcome. I feel like we only just scratched the surface. I wish we had another hour because there's like so much more stuff going on in this book that we could talk about, like fascism, America, puppet dictatorships in South America in the Cold War, like beautiful descriptions of fatherhood and your daughter in this book that like put me on the verge of tears. Like this is a really rich, wonderful book, and I hope everyone who listens to this goes out and buys it, even pre-orders it, so that you get a nice jump to getting this book out into the world and recommended and all that kind of stuff. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this with us, Diego. It's been great.
Absolutely. Dave, do we have any housekeeping on your agenda items here? I would say normally around this time of the year we would be releasing our year-end wrap-up episode, and where we go through our sort of top books of the year, and I would say that's going to be later. We've kind of gotten on a cadence of doing that later than other people. There's a lot of lists going around right now anyway, so
yeah, we'll probably do that next month in January. Hopefully like early-ish January.
This is another thing
so people can expect that.
I hate about corporate America, where you have to submit your like annual review on like December 12th, and it's like half the month still. Technically it's not the end of the year yet, can I use
that makes me, the Spotify rap thing drives me nuts. It's like November 30th and everyone's posting, like I'm like, there's still a good 2 weeks of
there's still time.
Records that could come out here, like like show me this on December 31st.
It's the fiscal year, which definitely was a white person who invented that. Of like, it's the year starts over just whenever I say it does. Okay, whatever. But our fiscal year will start over probably that year and wrap up in January rather than December. So more to come from us. We still are around. We have not done a ton of episodes this year. I just will blame.
It's been slow. Life's been.
I'll just blame Dave.
Energy sapping. It's blame me. Absolutely. Having a 2-year-old and trying to work full time and do a podcast and lots of other things is. I'm finding it very challenging these days to keep any kind of regular release schedule. So thanks for bearing with us this year in our kind of glacial pace.
But if you're still listening to this at the hour mark here, we are still an active podcast, so don't unsubscribe from us in your feed. We have plans of putting out I would say a bunch more, but I'm like, let's be honest, more episodes next year.
I hope there's more next year than there were this year.
More in 2024 than we did in
2023. That's our attempted pledge.
But if you
no promises.
If you have feedback for us, we'd love to get an email. We have at least one listener I want to give a shout out to for sending us a annual voice message. His name is
Ben Felony's Diamond.
Ben Diamond. Thank you. We love getting those notes from people. It just makes us feel like there are actually people listening to this when we put it out in the world, rather than just no feed crickets, So
I feel like the death of Twitter's maybe contributed to this feeling a little bit too. Like, that used to be a place where there's a lot of sort of engagement for us with people who listen. And now it's like no one's going on there in the same kind of way, I suspect. So self included.
I still go on there just because I don't know any better, and the power of inertia is real. And
I've heard of Mastodon, I've heard of Blue Sky. I don't really know.
I have signed up for all of them, and I've done an experiment where I posted on the same thing on like Threads, Mastodon, Blue Sky, and I just got very little engagement on any of them. So it's just whatever's easiest for you, but we don't have.
Come to Instagram. That's the best place.
We still
to
on
hit
Instagram,
us up, I think.
All right. Well, thanks again for being with us today, Diego. This has been great.
Yeah, thanks, Diego.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Into darkness, I thought to be extinct.
Dave, you're making a lot of shuffling.
I know. Just getting the book.